And on this episode, we're going to be talking about 10 scientific miracles in the Bible. Starting at number 10, we have the Earth's free float in space. Now, the Bible proclaims that the Earth freely floats in space. Some in ancient times thought that the Earth actually sat on a large animal, but we know now that that's not true. The Earth is actually just flying and floating in space. In the book of Job, chapter 26, verses 7, was written about 3,500 years ago. It says, "He stretches out the north over empty space. He hangs the earth on nothing." Next up, the miracle at number 9 is the Earth being round. The Bible records that the Earth is actually round, though it was commonly believed that the Earth was flat. Back then, some today still believe the Earth is flat, but that's another story. But it was actually these scriptures that inspired Christopher Columbus to sail around the world. And then he wrote, "It was the Lord who put it into my mind." There is no question the inspiration was from the Holy Spirit, because he comforted me with rays of marvelous illumination from the Holy Scriptures. And that was taken from his diary in reference to the discovery of the New World. In the book of Isaiah, chapter 40, verses 22, it says, "It is he who sits above the circle of the earth." Number 8 brings us the first law of thermodynamics. The Hebrew word used in the upcoming verse is the past definite tense for the verb finished, indicating an action completed in the past, never again occurring. So the creation was finished once and for all. This is exactly what the first law of thermodynamics says. So in the book of Genesis, the first book of the Bible, chapter 2, verses 1, after creation, it says, "Thus the heavens and the earth and all the hosts of them were finished." Now, this law, also referred to as the law of conservation of energy and or mass, states that neither matter nor energy can be either created or destroyed. So there is no creation ongoing today. Creation in its original sense is finished. Anything that we see nowadays is just modification of what was already there. While we're on the topic of the first law of thermodynamics, we gotta mention the second law of thermodynamics, and that comes in at number 7. In the book of Psalms, chapter 102, verses 25 and 26, that passage says, "Of old you founded the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands. Even they will perish, but you endure, and all of them will wear out like a garment." So in the Bible, it's recorded 3 times that the earth is wearing out like a garment. Now, this is the second law of thermodynamics, or the law of increasing entropy. And it states that in all physical processes, every ordered system over time tends to become more disordered. Everything is running down and wearing out as energy is becoming less and less available for use. That means the universe will eventually, quote unquote, wear out, something that wasn't discovered by science until fairly recently. The scientific miracle at number 6 is the hydraulic cycle. So to give you an example, the Mississippi River dumps over 6 million gallons of water per second into the Gulf of Mexico. Now, where does all that water go? Well, that's just one of thousands of rivers. And the answer actually lies within the hydrologic cycle, something not fully understood up until the 17th century, but it was also mentioned in the Bible. In the book of Amos, chapter 9, verses 6, which was written 2,800 years ago, it says, "He calls for the waters of the sea and pours them out on the face of the earth." So the scripture says this, and I quote, "All the rivers run into the sea, yet the sea is not full to the place from which the rivers come. There they return again." And that was found in the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 1, verses 7. Also in the book of Psalms 135, verses 7, it says, "He causes the vapors to ascend from the ends of the earth. He makes lightning for the rain." And finally, in the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 11, verses 3, it states that if the clouds are full of rain, they empty themselves upon the earth. So that was a loaded one right there. We see the hydrological cycle mentioned several times there. So Christians and Bible believers believe that this was a scientific miracle in the Bible. At number 5, we have countless stars. Talking about space always fascinates me. And in the book of Jeremiah, chapter 33, verses 22, it says, "As the host of heaven cannot be numbered, nor the sand of the sea measured." So people who believe the Bible assert that the host of the heavens refers to the stars. And when the statement was recorded, no one knew how vast the stars were, as fewer than 1100 were actually observable. And that's as many actually as Ptolemy was able to catalog in the Almagest. But now we know that there are countless billions of stars. There's actually no number that you can put on it. So we talked about water a little bit before in this episode, but at number 4, let's talk about it a little bit more because we have the science of oceanography. So looking at the book of Psalms chapter 8 verses 8, that scripture says, "And the fish of the sea that pass through the paths of the seas." Now the sea is just a huge mass of water. Now how could it have paths? So people discovered the existence of ocean currents in the 1850s, but the Bible declared this some 2800 years ago. Matthew Maury, who lived between the years of 1806 to 1873, considered the father of oceanography. He noticed the expression paths of the sea in the book of Psalms. So he took that as fact, and his vital book on oceanography is still in print today. There's also mention of the origin of life in the Bible. Now, scientists in the 21st century admit that they have lots of theories, all relating to the origin of life, but the Bible mentions the beginning very clearly. In the book of Genesis, chapter 2, verses 7, it says this, "And the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being." Now, there was one quote that says, "The likelihood of the spontaneous formation of life from inanimate matter is 1 to a number with 40,000 knots after it. It is big enough to bury Darwin and the whole theory of evolution. There was no primeval soup, neither on this planet nor on any other. And if the beginnings of life were not random, they must therefore have been the product of purposeful intelligence." And that was from Sir Fred Hoyle, who was a professor of astronomy at the Cambridge University. At number 2, we have the origin of sexes. So almost all forms of complex life have both male and female. You know, we look at the animal kingdom, horses, dogs, us humans, of course, fish, monkeys, elephants, birds, you name it. Now, the male needs the female to reproduce, and the female needs the male to reproduce as well. One cannot carry on life without the other. So this is where Bible believers sort of debunk the theory of evolution, because if the theory of evolution were true, then which came first according to the theory? If the male came into being before the female, how did the male of each species produce without females? How is it possible that a male and a female each spontaneously came into being, yet they have complex complementary reproductive systems? If each sex was able to reproduce without the other, why and how would they have developed a reproductive system that requires both sexes in order for the species to survive? So the Bible, on the other hand, states that both male and female came into existence. In the book of Matthew, chapter 19, verses 4, it says, "He who made them at the beginning made them male and female." And finally, we reach the end of this episode. At number 1, we have blood is the source of life. So the scriptures mentions in several places, especially in the book of Leviticus, that the blood is the source of life. Leviticus chapter 17 verses 11, it says, "For the life of the flesh is in the blood." Up until about 2,000 years ago, sick people were bled, and many died because of that practice. Now we know that blood is the source of life. It carries water and nourishment to every cell, and it removes the waste material from cells, and it maintains the body's temperature. So this vital element also carries oxygen from the lungs throughout the entire body. And if you lose all your blood, well, of course, you're going to lose all your life. That's also mentioned in the book of Genesis as well. Starting at number 10, we have 1 Timothy 2 verses 11 to 12. And this says, "Let a woman learn in silence with full submission. Permit no woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She is to keep silent." Now, a lot of this has to go with the belief that God made Adam first and then Eve, so man is first, and also man is seen as the head of the household according to the Bible. So many say that this passage isn't necessarily saying that women should never be in a capacity to teach at all and need to always have their mouth shut, but rather in the context of being ahead of the man, she should never usurp that authority over the man. Next up is Exodus 21 verses 20 to 21. When a slave owner strikes a male or female slave with a rod and the slave dies immediately, the owner shall be punished. But if the slave survives a day or two, there is no punishment, for the slave is the owner's property. And now when we hear the term slavery, a lot of people think back to harsh slavery. And in this case, it seems like, beating a slave, yeah, that's a very harsh and severe punishment. Now, people look at the time that this verse was revealed and that slavery was a common thing, and this verse was given to just help regulate what was happening at that time. But there are many Christians out there who believe that this passage has absolutely no holding on anybody today. Number 8 brings us Ephesians 6 verses 5, and it says, "Slaves, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, in singleness of heart, as you obey Christ." Now, part of the confusion around this passage is the fact that the term slave is used, but in actuality, the word slave from the Greek is doulos, and that can also be translated as servant or employee. So this passage has been interpreted to be saying that if you're serving somebody in any capacity, really serve them with dedication, with all your mind, all your heart. Moving on to number 7, Deuteronomy chapter 23 verses 2. "Those born of an illicit union shall not be admitted to the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation. None of their descendants shall be admitted to the assembly of the Lord." Now, for a lot of people, there's a big problem around the fact that this is up until 10 generations later, and it involves innocent people who had nothing to do with anything that happened previously. But then there's also the teaching that regardless of what we do, it has a long ripple effect down the line. Leviticus chapter 20 verses 9 comes up next. "All who curse father or mother shall be put to death. Having cursed father or mother, their blood is upon them." Now, a lot of people alive right now would have a lot of issue with this verse. This has also been one of the passages in times past that parents would use on their children to inflict fear in them so that their children would obey them and not stray from the path that was set out before them. But we can see why many children would have a lot of issue with this, and not even just the children, people in general. We continue with number 5, and this takes us to the book of Deuteronomy chapter 17 verses 12. "As for anyone who presumes to disobey the priest appointed to minister there to the Lord your God, or the judge, that person shall die. So you shall purge the evil from Israel. All the people will hear and be afraid, and will not act presumptuously." This passage indicates the rising up against people in power, just so that society can remain under control. And there are countries that still have similar laws to this day if you try to rise up against those who are in power. Mark 12 verses 19 comes up next, and it goes, "Teacher, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies leaving a wife but no child, the man shall marry the widow and raise up children for his brother." Now, this came at a time where women didn't necessarily have the same amount of rights in society as they do now, and having the male figure in her life was a pretty big part, because a woman was to look after the children and most likely had stayed home, and the man would go out and work. But then if the man had died, then the person next in kin to him would have to assume the responsibility of looking after that person's wife and children. At number 3, we're looking at Leviticus 20 verses 10. "If a man commits adultery with the wife of his neighbor, both the adulterer and the adulteress shall be put to death." Adultery was a big sin in ancient Israel, and this passage definitely highlights that. Another passage from the book of Leviticus, this one taken from chapter 20 verses 27, and this goes, "A man or woman who is a medium or a wizard shall be put to death. They shall be stoned to death. Their blood is upon them." All right, another very strict law when it came to the ancient Israelites. They were to be a monotheistic nation and group of people, so anything that interfered with that would have to be severely punished. But for those who had various religious practices and spiritual beliefs, well, this verse wasn't digested too well. And finally, we end this episode off with Mark chapter 9 verses 43 in the New Testament of the Bible. And that goes as follows: if your hand causes you to stumble, cut it off. It is better for you to enter life maimed than to have two hands and to go to hell, to the unquenchable fire. Now, there's been numerous interpretations of this verse. Some say it is literal. Some say Jesus was being symbolic, like something dear to you, as close as your right hand, is causing you to sin. Might as well get rid of it so that you can enter eternal life and be saved from hellfire. But either way, symbolic or literal, you guys be the judge. Starting at number 10, we have the fish and the coins. You can find the story in the book of Matthew chapter 17 verses 24 to 26. Jesus and his disciples, they're asked to pay their taxes, and Jesus says that they are exempt, but out of politeness, he actually agrees to go and pay for the taxes, but in a very supernatural way. What he did was he made 4 drachma coins appear inside of a fish, and when it was caught, he and his apostle Peter were able to pay their taxes. Now, moving on to the story at number 9, God wrestles a man. This account is taken from the book of Genesis 32 verses 22 to 31. Now, the prophet Jacob is moving to a different place, and his wife as well as his 11 sons have gone ahead of him, but out of nowhere, without any warning, he starts wrestling with a man who just shows up, and this goes all night. Now, when the man is at a disadvantage, he knows that he's losing. What happens is he touches Jacob's hip and it pops out of place. Now, Jacob says that he's not going to let go of this man until he gets a blessing from him. So the man ends up admitting that he is actually God, and he pops Jacob's hip back in place. Number 8 brings us the mysterious resurrections in the book of Matthew chapter 27 verse 52. The Gospel of Matthew claims that Jesus wasn't actually the only one who was resurrected back to life. It says the bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. Now, they came out of their tombs after Jesus' resurrection and went into the holy city of Jerusalem and appeared to many people. And this account, yes, is found in Matthew 27 verses 52. But the Gospel of Matthew doesn't tell too much about who these people were or what they did after they resurrected. Did they just continue on with their lives? Did they live brand new lives? Did they interact with their family members? So many questions and literally no answers found in the Bible about this. Another story from the book of Matthew. This one is taken from chapter 21 verses 18. As Jesus was walking with his disciples, he came across a fig tree, and the tree didn't have any fruit on it, so Jesus decided to curse the tree. And Jesus, he focused all of his faith and attention on this tree, and it began to wither away very quickly, actually. And Jesus' followers, they were amazed. They were surprised that this tree could just wither so quickly. But really what Jesus was doing was showing his disciples that if they have true faith, very strong faith, they could do this, as well as even tell a mountain to jump into the sea, and it would happen. The story at number 6 is dedicated to all the people who fall asleep during church. In the New Testament book of Acts chapter 20 verses 7 to 13, St. Paul was preaching in a town called Troas, and a teenager by the name of Eutychus, he decided that he would sit in the windowsill on the 3rd story of a home where Paul was preaching, and the sermon was going very, very long and long and long. So Eutychus started getting tired, and he ended up falling asleep, and he fell out of the window and broke his neck. And when everybody was shocked, oh my God, he's dead, he's dead. Nope, Paul brings him back to life. Halfway in at number 5, hair caught in the tree. This story is found in the book of 2 Samuel, specifically in chapter 18 verses 6 to 33. Now, King David's son, Absalom, whose beauty is actually praised within the Bible, he staged a coup and drove his father, King David, out of Jerusalem. Later on, when David had gathered his supporters to take the kingdom back, Absalom had fled on a horse, and his hair was so long. And as a matter of fact, his hair, he would grow it out all year and cut it once a year after he weighed it. Either way, it got tangled up in a tree and he was left there hanging until he was found and killed. Number 4 is a very strange one. It's found in the book of Ezekiel chapter 4. God tells Ezekiel that in a memorial of the siege of Jerusalem, he needs to build a model of the city. And then he also needs to lay down on his left side for 390 days and then on his right side for 40 days. And during this time, he's only allowed to eat bread which he is to bake with human poop. But Ezekiel, he protests against this, and God ends up allowing him to use cow poop to bake his food instead. Yeah, very, very strange one. Moving on to number 3, David shows his love, and this is found in the book of 1 Samuel 18 verse 25 to 27. David is madly in love with King Saul's daughter, Michal, and he offers Saul anything he wants to let him marry her. So what did Saul do? Well, he actually orders David to go out and kill the enemy, and as a proof that he killed the enemy, he's supposed to bring back 100 foreskins from enemy soldiers. But David, of course, is driven by love, and he is an overachiever, so he ends up bringing back 200 foreskins. Throws them down in front of Saul, and Saul is very, very, very impressed because David, he overachieved, and he ends up giving his wife to David to marry. Another story from the Old Testament in the book of 1 Chronicles 13 verses 1 to 14. Now there is also a parallel version of this story in the book of 2 Samuel chapter 6, but as the story goes, the circumstances surrounding Uzzah losing his life, it's pretty surprising. King David had decided to bring the Ark of the Covenant back to Jerusalem, and he had built a new ox cart to carry it back. And as they were traveling toward Jerusalem, the oxen, they stumbled, and Uzzah, who was walking with the cart, he put out his hand to just hold the Ark of the Covenant in place because this was a valuable treasure for the children of Israel. And to quote a specific passage from the Bible, then the anger of the Lord was aroused against Uzzah, and he struck him because he put his hand on the ark, and he died there before God. And that's found in the book of 1 Chronicles 13 verse 10. Now, it seems like that would be an automatic knee-jerk reaction on the part of Uzzah to hold the Ark of the Covenant in place because it's going to fall. But no, his actions were regarded so serious that God had to take his life away. Now we end off with another very, very, very bizarre story, Lot and his daughters. So Lot and his 2 daughters had just fled the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, and they were hiding out in some caves. After all, they have really nowhere to go. And his daughters were worried because they don't see any men around. They're wondering, how are we going to have offspring? So what do? They decide to get their father Lot drunk on 2 separate nights, and his own daughters, well, they have intimate relations with them, get pregnant. The other one does the exact same thing, gets their father drunk, has intimate relations, get pregnant, and they both give birth to sons who each start great dynasties afterwards. For the story at number 10, we have God shows Moses his back, and this is found in the book of Exodus chapter 33 verses 18 to 23. God and prophet Moses, they are known to have direct communication throughout many of the early sections of the Jewish Bible. Moses asks God to reveal his glory, but God warns that anyone who views his divine face will pass away. So God covers Moses' face with his hands and passes by and only shows Moses his back. The story at number 9 involves the sun and the moon standing still, and this is taken from the book of Joshua chapter 10 verses 12 to 14. God responds to our prayer by making the sun and moon just completely stop so that Joshua could continue a major battle during daytime. Now, to quote some of the passage, it goes as follows. So the sun stood still in the midst of heaven and did not hasten to go down for about a whole day. And there has been no day like that before it and after it that the Lord heeded the voice of a man, for the Lord fought for Israel. The story at number 8 involves a talking donkey. We find this in the book of Numbers 22 verses 21 to 34. A man by the name of Balaam was summoned by a king to go and curse his enemies, but God sent an angel to block the road. Only Balaam's donkey was able to see the angel, and he got scared. So it tries to avoid the angel, and Balaam's foot gets crushed on some walls beside them because they were riding through a narrow path at the time. And the angel doesn't leave, so the donkey lies down. It's not moving. It's really scared. And Balaam gets frustrated. He starts beating the donkey a total of 3 times. And then the donkey starts to speak to him and says, "Am I not your own donkey, which you have always ridden? Have I been in the habit of doing this to you?" And Balaam responds. He says, "No." And finally, he's able to see the angel himself and realizes that going and cursing his enemies is not a good idea at all. The story number 7 involves a Babylonian king, Nebuchadnezzar, who ends up eating grass. And this story can be found in the book of Daniel chapter 4. It concludes in verses 33. King Nebuchadnezzar was the king of Babylon, and he viewed himself as all-powerful. So God decided to put Nebuchadnezzar in his place by making him think that he was a cow. Yeah, a beast of the field. So Nebuchadnezzar, he goes mad. He starts to go out into the fields. He's eating grass. His hair is growing out. His nails are growing out. And this lasts for 7 years. And after 7 years, he finally regains his sanity, and he's humble out of this whole process. So he ends up worshiping God in the end. Pillar of salt comes in at number 6. Now it concludes in Genesis chapter 19 verses 26, but leading up to that passage, we read a story where God has reached his limit of mercy with the 2 cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, and he's sending judgment on those cities. Now Lot, who's the nephew of the great prophet Abraham, is warned by angels to flee to safety with his family. As Lot and his family are leaving, they are warned to not look back at all. Just keep on going, don't look back. Unfortunately though, his wife looks back and she instantly becomes a pillar of salt. Halfway in, the story at number 5 is found in the book of 1 Kings chapter 20 verses 35 to 38. Now, there was a prophet who was planning to disguise himself as a wounded person, and he had asked someone who was accompanying him to strike him and wound him with his weapon. But the companion refused to do so. So the prophet, who was speaking on behalf of God, looked at his companion and said that since he refused to obey the word of the Lord, well, a lion is going to come and eat him. And that's what happens when the prophet leaves. Now, the prophet found another person and asked him to do the exact same thing, strike him and wound him with his weapon. And that person ends up listening, and his life is spared. Story number 4 is found in the book of 2 Kings chapter 2 verses 23 to 24. Elisha, who is the successor of the prophet Elijah, was walking along the road to Bethel when a group of 42 young boys ran up to him, and as kids do, they started to taunt him because he had a bald head, and they were saying things like, "Get out of here, baldy." So he looked at the boys, he cursed them in the name of the Lord, and 2 bears came out of the woods and ate those children, just like that. And Elisha continues on his way. Snakes on a staff come in next at number 3, and this is found in the book of Numbers 21 verses 5 to 7. So the people of ancient Israel, they began to get discouraged, and their unbelief was kicking in. They started to complain against Moses for bringing them into the wilderness, and they were blaming God for abandoning them. And because of this, they tried to put all the blame on Moses. And as a punishment against the people, God sent some poisonous serpents into their midst, and they tormented the people, and some people even lost their lives. Now, Moses, he had sympathy, and he was praying to God for God to relieve the people of this. And God told him to make a bronze serpent and put it on a staff so that when people looked at it, they were healed. And that's what happened. The story number 2 is a pretty sad one. It's found in the book of Judges chapter 11 verses 29 to 40. When a man of God named Jephthah was in battle, he promised that he would sacrifice to God whatever comes out to greet him when he returns back home. And of course he was thinking that this would be an animal or something, because animals do that when they see their owners come back. They run out, they bark if it's a dog or whatever. But unfortunately in his case, it turned out to be his daughter who first greeted him. And he voiced his grief and sorrow at the thought of losing his daughter. But his daughter has a surprising reply. She says, well, you made a promise to the Lord, so you gotta do what you gotta do. She does ask, however, for an extension of life for 2 months to be exact, but at the end of those 2 months, she is sacrificed by her father. Now, finally, we end off with a pretty dark one, at number 1. It's found in the book of Judges, chapter 19, verses 22 to 30. A man was traveling with his concubine or mistress and is invited as a guest in another man's home. But there was a gang of men in the town that saw this man enter, and they were really attracted to him. So they started to bang on the door that the man was a guest in and ask for him to be sent out. So the owner of the house begs the men outside to stop banging on the door and leave his male guest alone. But they persist, and the man offers his own daughter to them, also his guest's concubine he offers for the men outside. But the gang of men, they still keep on begging for the male guest. So they end up pushing out the male guest's concubine outside of the house to satisfy the gang of men. Now, the gang of men, they do all sorts of indescribably horrible things to her all night until morning. And when the male guest finds her in the morning, she's on the ground in front of the home. She's passed away. He takes her home on his donkey, and then he proceeds to chop her body up into 12 pieces, which he sends to the various different parts of ancient Israel to show people how evil they have become.